What are some examples in rhetoric that are like how you that he talks about in terms of how you speak to other people?
Well, he's not making any normative things in here or normative claims. He's just saying how you talk to people and to bring out certain effects. He's not saying whether, when, not when to apply it, just this is how emotions work. This is how you arouse certain emotions. For instance, if you want to encourage people to not judge people as harshly, say as a defense attorney, you might want to wait to make a judgment, say, wait till something else going on, say nationally or whatever, that like expends their anger or their strong emotions, that like the day later they're not as feeling as intense. So you might want to do things like delay talking about things just to get a lesser response, or say you might want to emphasize the decency of a person if you want to arouse. And a way to do that could be to arouse pity in people. I mean, that sort of thing, like, or
so how would you, does he give an example of how you would arouse pity in someone? Isn't this is like the sophists teach? It sounds like what the sophists taught. They were, I like
a little bit.
Leonard described them as like debased Dale Carnegies.
Yeah, but it's not strictly being a sophist about it. I mean, you do need an extern for a speech to be effective. You do want it to arouse certain emotions. Right. But Aristotle doesn't ever really say that you should use lies or truth, but understand what the words you say do. Right. That if you're having an effect on people, know what it does. So he lists usually a list of things like what makes people angry. So, and anger can help to make people more willing to heed a warning, for example. Right. You're saying there's a war coming. You need to convince people the war matters. You should arouse their emotion. I mean, emotion is not irrelevant. On top of logical argument, it's, I mean, emotion is part of it. It's one piece of rhetoric. And there is, the translation I got is Joe Saxon. It comes with the translation of a Socratic dialogue too, the Gorgias, which is all about rhetoric. And they do discuss, well, what is the proper way to argue and use emotion, and all that is what is proper, what is not. So that's part of the, like, I'm going to read that next just to get the fuller picture of, because Aristotle in effect is almost responding to that dialogue by writing this.
I see, that's interesting. It is, I read some of the principles of communication, and I got that it's a separate skill, meaning you can think well, but then there's a skill which you wouldn't be able to learn that from a book. It would be, so this is rhetoric. You'd have to almost have lots of experience with people and see how, what the connotations for different words are. And that's just like experiential. There's no like thing you can memorize for that.
That's what he calls it in art.
Right.
It's rhetoric in art, because there is that inexactness that you do need to go by the individual case sometimes.
Right.
But he's trying to at least find some general principles that we could apply to any case. Since rhetoric is supposed to be applied to any field, so it can be generalized. Right. It's not supposed to be able to say, how do you argue properly in geology or something? I mean, that's, those are specific principles. And it's a different science, different art.
Right. Yeah, it's, anyway, I don't know, I lost my train of thought, but yeah, we'll move on. I wanted to ask you about, you said you, as a science, you like biology. You find biology interesting?
Yeah. Or zoology, honestly, but yeah.
Oh, zoology.
Biological things.
Classification. Zoology is like classification of animals, right?
Well, it's more like observation of animals. I guess it's the same thing. I guess I would call it a type of biology. I'm not really sure.
Okay.
But I like thinking of animals that you would like observing them act, observing them in their environment,
Right.
things like that. Not strictly
Right.
like biology. How does metabolism work? I'm not really into that.
Yeah, I get it. What do you think is I went for a walk in the park. Well, I went for a run in the park, and then actually I did both, but I went for a walk in the botanical gardens in my city. And some people love being in nature. I went with a friend, and he says like it's so good. He loves spending his time in nature, like sitting on the grass. I don't share that sentiment. Like to me, I find nature boring, and but I know that other people find it fascinating. But there's like something to unlocking this perspective, or the secrets of nature, if you want to call it that, that makes people so fascinated by it. Do you have any leads in terms of like what that is? Is it
Well, sometimes I
observation?
feel that way about like chemistry. Sometimes like I find it weird and not that interesting, but some people love it.
Yeah,
But what I like about zoology and things like that is I like thinking about the complexity of those things. How an animal seems to have ends and yeah, things like that, more the Aristotelian sense that
right,
they seem to act for a reason, that they guide, and that it treats things as a holistic thing. It's easier to think of things as interacting and self-caused and things like that, to think of them as animals. Like it's like
right.
a higher level of abstraction I find that's
Yep.
interesting. I like the psychological nature, the way the things aren't always as they seem. They get to actually observe also. I mean, it just seems to be an integration of um it's just how things operate. Like the biology just seems to be more expressive about the way everything in the world works.
Right. And then what about trees, for example? Because I agree that if I like, sometimes I will enjoy observing an animal, because all the different things it does could be, it has some wider purpose. But then take a tree, for example. If you just look at a tree, like some people love it. I just think it's boring. Like it doesn't move. It just stays there. there's not,
Yeah.
there's like, it's like, there's no excitement. There's no challenge. It's just a tree. And, but some people see something in it, right? And so where would you stand
Yeah.
in terms of like then plants? You like what, observing animals because of all the complex
I
behavior,
feel
but
the
then
same way about plants.
I see. Okay,
I
interesting.
think I know it's partly my interest. I mean, it's the way my mind seems to work, that
Yeah,
I like to think about those sort of things. I mean, I don't think there's even like a best topic, but to me it works with the
yeah,
way I like to observe things.
right,
I think trees show something of, even trees can show how even that can have an end, even if it's not psychological. Like I
right,
like observing how things are, what animacy does to a thing. How does this non-material thing seem to exist? Like you can't just see something that makes it alive. You
right.
see it being alive, but you
Yeah,
don't see a thing that is life.
yeah,
Like it's
that's
a
true.
process. Just is that sort of abstraction that fascinates me. See,
Right.
how does a tree grow? Why does it stop growing even? Like, how does it know it's done? Why does it die? Things like that.
Yeah, those are interesting questions, actually.
Yeah, which I can see why Darwin liked those questions and why
Yeah,
he looked to
obviously.
Aristotle.
Yes,
And he
that's a
did
good example.
admire Aristotle. Like he said, Aristotle was the best biologist, like ever. And
Right,
that's why, and that is why I like it too. Like the similar things, what there's this complexity that it seems like there's this purpose, but how can we talk about that without just saying it's God or something? Which
right.
is fascinating how you can make it natural. That's just the way things are naturally. There's
Yeah.
no hand that determines it.
I got up to the lecture on Descartes, and he was saying, it was an aside because he said they weren't that significant, but he talked about the occasionalists. Do you know who they were?
Heard of that? I know
Yeah.
the term.
Descartes was trying to reconcile, how do you basically mind and body, like how do you get a soul which is independent of the body then moving the body, and he got himself into all this trouble.
Right.
And then the occasionalist said that what happens is that mind and body are separate. They don't, like, but your soul, when you have an impulse to do something, God intervenes and sends the signal to your body. Or when a sense perception hits you and starts redounding in you through your nerves and so on, then God intervenes and sends it to your soul. Because they tried to, I thought it was kind of, I liked it. It was kind of, they were stuck in that frame. But speaking to, living things, it is, conceptualizing.
It's a creative answer.
It is a creative. It is a creative answer, but it's a pretty crummy one in terms of
yes,
when you get stuck. But it's still, I liked it. Yeah. Okay.
I wrote something, by the way, about, you were asking about how to decide what to study, or what fields to look into, or to what extent.
Right.
And I just wrote something brief on that. We can get that to that later, or
what is it?
Whatever order you want. Well, I list ways that how to decide what to study, and why creative activities should be part of that too.
Okay. Is it written?
Yeah, it's written down. I could send it to you and you can talk about it next time, or we could
Yeah,
talk
that
about
sounds. No, send it so I can read through it and think about it, and then we'll talk about it.
Sure. We'll do that.
Actually, I just remembered the random comment I wanted to make on what you're saying about rhetoric, which is, it seems a bit like there are principles, which is what you talked about. So you want to rouse relevant emotions with any point you're like logical point you're making, because it's emotions, or Aristotle called like the spirited element, which is what motivates man to do
Well,
things.
in specific contexts, like he says specifically say when political speeches in the courtroom, or say in a celebration. So it's not necessarily like regular arguments that you don't want to bother with. That is where the fuller sense of like a speech, an oration, like making a big point, that's where rhetoric is relevant. Say, I mean, like the speeches in Atlas Shrugged, think of that. I mean, that is rhetoric.
Okay. Then it's kind of like, so there's principles, and it's also a statistical science. And I mean that in the sense of, if it's not exact and it's approximate, and you're dealing with people who differ, you sort of go with what is most common. Like, okay, this word is commonly used to connote this, and that may produce an effect in, let's say, most people, but it's approximate in the sense that some people are just going to differ. They're going to have some weird connotation to it, and you can't account for that. That's just part of rhetoric, right? So in that sense, it's a statistical science, yeah?
Yeah, that's what he means by an art. When he says like that is an art, that's exactly what he's trying to say. He would acknowledge, I'm sure, that there can be a science of the things that rhetoric talks about.
Yeah,
like he probably would say, yeah, there's a science about emotions, but if we want to talk about the art of rhetoric, we do need to at least be willing to have that uncertainty. And he says medicine is the same way too, because each case really is a unique case. We can make principles about medicine, about like the science of what makes things so, what makes things necessarily the case, but each case is unique. And you can't, as a doctor, just say, oh, this one's like all the other ones, except to say that, oh yeah, there's this illness that's the same, but the case itself is always different. Each individual is like an infinite. For any particular, there's almost an infinite amount of information for it. The incidental things, the things that are important, things that are essential. So there's almost no way to get a absolute infinite stock on every single fact. Rather, we generalize, we use abstractions, but the concrete itself is what we're dealing with this art. And each concrete is unique in some way.
I guess this is before you have a concept of objectivity, where you're saying you can have a good and a bad art, and there are principles for that art. For example, shoemaking or something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a good way to do the art and a bad way to do the art. There's things that are effective for the most part and things that wouldn't be effective, or things that fail to imitate nature properly and things that don't fail to do that. Like there's a successful way to make a play and an unsuccessful way. It's a good way to make a tragedy and a bad way to make a tragedy. Things like that. Like you could be a bad doctor still, because you know, in terms of how you fail, whether you succeed at some of the general principles.
But rhetoric would be different in the sense that if I produce shoes, there's less, like I can, you know, I can't just make a circular object and then some people will like, most people won't like it, but some people will like it. Like that just won't work. If I make some kind of circular plate I attach to the bottom of a foot. But in the case of rhetoric, it may be the case that the way I speak for most people will arouse emotion, but for some it won't at all. And then, you know what I'm saying? I'm trying to draw that distinction between them. Like, so what is that difference then in terms of Aristotle's way of thinking?
I actually don't know yet. That's a good question. But I think there is a part I remember reading. I think he does deal with the very similar example of what you said.
I see.
He does mention shoemaking a few times. So I know that much. But I don't know a good answer to that.
Okay. Do you know much about Aquinas and Lutheranism?
No. Not between the two of them, no.
Okay. Aquinas was Christianity and Aristotelian ethics. Lutheranism was back to Augustine's philosophy, and it was much more malevolent and so on. But the reason I bring it up and why I found it interesting is that he said, Leonard in the lecture said that you'd think that, so Lutheranism, because it was based in this Augustinian view of the world, which is much more malevolent and like torture yourself and so on, logically, I thought before he said this, that, okay, that would mean that the countries that have Lutheranism as their philosophy, as their Christian philosophy, would be much worse off than the ones who are Catholic. But actually the reverse is true. It's true that those that are more Lutheran, which is the more malevolent version of Christianity, actually are more productive, they're happier, and I was trying to work out why that is. And I'm guessing that it's because it's so impracticable that you just throw it out in a sense altogether and it just becomes a side thing. Whereas Catholicism, because of the Aristotelian element, is more practicable. And so you kind of take in more of it. But I don't know, that's just me speculating.
In what sense were they more productive though?
Well, he just pointed out that if you look at the country, so, you know, America was more Lutheran than Catholic, and then I think Britain, what else? Germany, and then compare that to like South America, and what else did he say? Oh, I put in South America, but South America, Spain, which is more Catholic. Yeah, I can't remember more examples than that. I could probably find it, but
I would argue, based on a book I heard about recently, which I want to read, it's not that it was any aspect of the religion that it was just incidental. It's not even like that one is worse than the other. It's that Protestantism by nature is going further away from the church teaching that is more individual to some extent.
Okay.
And that at least opens up the door to more room for people to further go away from the church. Even if they're Lutheran for now, it opens up this environment where people aren't as strongly bound to Catholic dogma, which is more institutionalized, that there is no individual making choices. The Protestant does believe that the individual can interpret the Bible to some extent, but that would be sacrilege in the Catholic Church.
Right.
That you can't do that. Like, it's not up to you in any sense. That you take what's there and that's it, or something to that effect. And that at least makes a culture more open to the possibility that religion doesn't dictate everything about the way society works.
You're
And
right.
that
I
it
think
could make you work harder in the way you do have more freedom.
you're right. I missed that element. This was the end. I wrote this down. He
Right.
said, so he went on to describe how bad some of the philosophies were of Martin Luther and how malevolent he was and so on. But then he said the ultimate result, paradoxically, because you'd think, oh, how does that work? Was positive because the lack of formalized dogma and the emphasis on the liberty of the individual conscience was enormously anti-authoritarian. So there was no way to keep people in line anymore. It was just a mess.
The Lutherans were less able to control everyone in a way. They wanted more control, but the consequence with the individual thinking or whatever is actually the undermining of their own religion, actually. They undermine themselves.
That's interesting. Yeah, see at the end, that's where he says, he made that comment about Protestantism is much worse philosophically, but I guess there's an element, it's much worse philosophically, but then you could say there's an element in it that destroys that counters that or something like that.
Yeah, it destroys itself.
Right. Okay.
I can share the book. I'll email that with you or to you with notes too, so if you want to look at it. I didn't read it yet. It's just fascinating.
Which one is it?
Let me just tell you the name, actually. It's called Religion and the Rise of Capitalism.
Oh, what is, I'll look it up.
Yeah, it came out like this year. It's long, so. But
okay. Is it very historical with lots of random facts?
Looks like it. Well, not random facts, it seems. I already read a good review of it.
Okay.
So it seemed integrated enough that it'll tell an interesting story, it actually has like a thesis to work through, not just a collection of thoughts. It's more economic in nature, so.
Okay.
Yeah. So I don't know how dense it is, but it's exactly the sort of questions that are relevant to you, I think.
Right. Okay, let's go to Aristotle.
Sure. Yep.
So this is Ekin, whatever that Greek word is.
Yep.
So he's talking about the acquiring knowledge. Joe Sachs, this is part of Joe Sachs's introduction.
Yes.
So there's different perspectives on how you acquire knowledge. So to many of his predecessors, it's a passive state, but he thinks it's like an effort you make by holding yourself ready. Mm-hmm. And then he says, let's see, in the later section, it says, so Plato's image is we draw up knowledge out of ourselves. In Aristotle's metaphor, we settle down into knowing, which is interesting. I didn't quite get what it means to settle down into knowing. And then it gives an example. If you had to tell a child constantly what to do, it'd be hopeless. There's some effort on his part, right? We are indispensable to them, but they do all the work. It comes from without, the language they learn from outside, but it's not imposed, but is something that the deepest things in them reach out. This is the way Aristotle understands moral virtue. He says, virtues no more alter what we are than putting on its roof alters a house. So, there's a couple of things in here that I was curious about. So it seems a bit like, I don't quite get the idea of settling into oneself as a metaphor for knowing. What do you make of that?
That one's the tricky part. I think that's really the critical point of what does Aristotle mean? I think that would take a long time to fully understand, but what I understand so far about that, based on what I've read about, is like what he thinks contemplative reason is and what he thinks is virtuous and whatnot. I believe it's something to do with almost like habituating knowledge, that once you acquire something as knowledge, it settles into you in a way that it doesn't need to be like before you know something is not there, it's not available, and you have to put an effort, you metaphorically say, to put a struggle, a real effort into knowing. And
Okay.
once you do know it, it settles down into you as if it's part of you in a way. That you only need to be like contemplate or be aware of it. It's not as active anymore. Like, of course, you have to be active to use it, but to be knowledge that has settled down into you within who you are. And I think that's how I understand it.
Okay, that makes sense actually. That interpretation. I
Aristotle
think
sees
we
contemplative thought as something like focus, which is at least just a natural state of being able to like envision and foresee your knowledge, but not necessarily use it. Like you're contemplating, you're experiencing it, like in a that's more metaphorical, but it's like a vision. It's like a way of seeing, but not literally seeing.
I asked, I was like, I couldn't make sense of this active state. I did a bit more reading today, and I think now, rather than call it focus, because active state is a big component of what makes the character, I think. And I actually later interpreted it as a kind of psychoepistemology. So it's like part automated, actually. It's like the way you deal with emotions, but in Aristotle's case, he used it like in those distinct categories of like courage and fear and that kind of thing. But it is almost like this, what Rand describes as a psychoepistemology, like your method of function, your automatic method of functioning towards different things that come up, your emotions, your observations, your thoughts, and so on.
Yeah, it sounds right. It's not really like a focus more. It's like more than that. When you say active state, like, well, the active state is like you're actively using those capacities.
Right.
Not that they don't necessarily all are directly controlled, but you're actively doing something. It's not like a waiting or passivity. It's a reaction to the world, an interaction with the world even.
What did you make of, at the end, he says, he says this in the physics, it says, the passage is cited from the physics. Virtues no more alter what we are than putting on its roof alters a house. I didn't quite get that analogy. Like, what do you make of that?
Putting on the roof of a house.
Yeah, it's like virtues no more alter us than putting a roof on the house. Then putting a roof alters a house.
It sounds like there he's talking about what it means to be a house, to be like, I'm trying to think through this, because clearly it's not presently in that state of having a roof. And part of having a house is the shelter. So how could it couldn't be a house without the roof? But it's the virtues of
Maybe it's I don't know, but I'm going to guess maybe it's a very loose analogy to they complete you as a man. So you're still like, you still have all these desires and you still have all these other elements in you, but virtue is what makes you fully a man. Something like that.
I think it's just saying that it doesn't change what you are by nature of man, but it changes what you are in the sense of you might characterize your present state, but doesn't change what it means to be a man or to be human or things like that. In the same way, just doesn't having the roof does not alter what it means to be a house. But it is a weird analogy. I'm not sure I like it. I would rather look at the context. We are indispensable.
Okay, some of these questions now are just pretty, I'm trying to make sense of Sachs's language here. I'll let you read it and then we can discuss.
Virtues more than the capacities. Okay, so it's more than just the ability, what you could do. The way of arguing piece. Essential action. Yeah, it's all about the person acting. That's virtue ethics. The virtue of the actions in the person, not to be found outside the person. It's all about the person. And we might not notice. Yep. There's no point. We don't need hypotheticals because that makes sense. Because we have to analyze what people actually do, not even just what they could do. Yep.
Okay. What does he mean, by the way, by this way of arguing presupposes one of the central claims? Like, I didn't quite get what he presupposed it. Like, what does that mean? He presupposed this as this idea that it's a separate, like it's already built in implicitly that there's something that's separate from passive conditions. Is that what he's saying?
Well, I don't think it means presuppose in a negative sense. Just presuppose as in you have to understand that is the premise before understanding why you even said that. Why you would even say that.
Okay,
it's
I
an
see.
active state. I mean, if you think about an active state, well, that's only a question about the person doing. It's asking a question about the person acting. He's really asking what states are relevant. Do we care about passive states, active states, or whatnot?
Right.
But either way, it's still the person acting.
I didn't quite also get the connection to these like emergency ethical situations. Like, why would Aristotle think they're childish? That's interesting, but I didn't quite get why that would be.
Because they deal with the actions divorced from the person. Acting is just either consequentialist and you just look at the consequence of the action apart from the person, or you just look at the duty the person had, which isn't about the person, it's just the duty itself.
So
which is deontology.
What would be Aristotle's view then? Like what the person should do depends on the person. Is that sort of what he's getting at?
That virtue has to do with the character of a person. That we look at what it accomplishes for a person, or what a person should expect about the way they act, or the way they should think about how they ought to act themselves. Not what deed matters, but what it matters for their person, for their character. It's character focused.
But why wouldn't an example of like a sinking lifeboat be character focused? Like, what should the person? Yeah, I'm not clear.
Well, you have to reinterpret the question when somebody asks you about like that lifeboat scenario where the hit a button and kill thousands of people to avert war. I mean, that's not really looking at what is the way that affects the nature of people, or how does it affect the nature of the person doing it. It would be just looking at what are the consequences, i.e., 1,000 people died, war averted.
Okay. Oh, I see.
You can't think of it in such a simplistic way. At least that would be against his method.
Okay. All right. I think I get it.
That is a common way of thinking for many people who deal with ethical scenarios. You'll hear that all the time. Like the trolley problem is the same thing.
Right. Yeah, I saw that in, I think there was an essay Ayn Rand wrote called The Ethics of Emergencies, where a lot of those kind of scenarios are in ethics.
Yeah. She has a similar view, for sure.
Yeah, so he goes on to say, actually, this is near the end, Aristotle's view that no action is good or right, just or courageous because of any quality of its own. So, but I would have still thought that someone can act courageously. It doesn't make them courageous, but that's how they build courage. So why wouldn't the action itself be good or right?
Well, it's not because of the quality of its own. It's not the quality in the action of itself, in and of itself. It's trying to say that the virtue has to be an action with regard to the way you hold yourself. That it can't just be the action itself. Also, it should be in regard to how you view and hold yourself, in what way you want to see yourself in a certain way.
Okay.
I mean, we might be able to say that you've now decided to seek out to live out the virtue of courage, or you want to cultivate that virtue by holding yourself in that way. you might not be able to say, I'm a courageous person now, but you can say you hold yourself in regard to seeking to be courageous, acting in the ways that are consistent with courage or reason or rationality or honesty, whatever it might be.
Okay, I think I get it. So basically, it's just emphasizing there's always an end. So there's no action in and of itself that is good, but what is the end? That's what it's
Yeah, the
emphasizing.
ultimate like should be life for objectivism, and Aristotle is usually phrased it as happiness.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. Let me just see what the question is here.
And that is the common view of virtue ethics. Yeah, I learned that's important stuff to know, but yeah.
Say that again, sorry?
Yeah, that distinction is important to know, like virtue ethics, deontology, and consequentialism.
Right. Modern philosophy is the latter, right? Consequentialism and
mostly consequentialist over deontological these days.
Okay. Okay, I wanted to this. I found this interesting. So this part, and then this whole thing about a stable equilibrium, which I've got questions about.
Yeah. Okay.
Again, this seems like, well, I think of sense of life, of something that's kind of got a semi-permanent characteristic, like you can have a bad mood, but then you return to some baseline.
Yeah, the equilibrium line. You made that up, but return to equilibrium.
Right. So in order to choose the action knowingly and for its own sake. But what does it mean? I didn't think he supported choosing an action for its own sake.
How to explain that? For its own sake.
Maybe Joe Sachs has it wrong here. He's meant to say something like for the end. That's an end in itself. For its own
sake. I just have to explain this. I had it in my head, but how to put into words. I think it's more in terms of like the goodness of it is intrinsic to it, to that character trait or that virtue. So you seek it because it's an end in itself. That doesn't need to be for any other reason other than to pursue it. I think that's what it's trying to say.
Doesn't that contradict this thing here, though? That what we said about there's no intrinsically good action.
It's not that the action is intrinsic. I'm not trying to say that as much as there is something about the virtue that is good for its own sake. That is not that it's intrinsic necessarily, but that you just don't seek it for other reasons other than itself. There is no further reason to seek it other than itself. And I do think Aristotle doesn't quite integrate it, I guess, as much as you would hope with pursuing life, but I think that's what it's saying.
What would be an example of like, because I thought in the first chapter, he talks about like everything being for some end. There's actions that are actions taken for something beyond them, maybe another action and so on until you get to some end. So what then would it mean of like for its own sake?
That is just one of the ends.
Okay.
That I think that's the best answer I could give right now. That's a difficult one to phrase. But I do see what you mean, like equilibrium, I think, does seem to be part of what Aristotle thinks. And that you do have some natural states.
And virtue cannot, by this account, be an inflexible adherence to rules of duty or precedent. But because of it being a stable, what's the relationship with that to being in a stable equilibrium? You know, this is like the difficulty here is that there's so much that it's like not that easy to make sense of in a concrete way. that it makes it just hard to get value from.
Yeah, it is hard. It's like, it's gonna weight below the center. In a way, I still feel like it's still talking about the way the entity himself acts, how the person himself is. We're trying to reason from the nature of how they function.
Okay.
We're not trying to reason from first the actions. We're reasoning first from the person's character.
Right. Okay.
Or their way of being, or what makes man man.
Okay. Let me cross this question out.
I think
Okay,
people often would think about ethics as the person's incidental, but the action's essential. But the person seems to be most essential.
I see.
That's how I would view it.
Okay, so I think I mean, this is continuing on from me talking about active state being like sense of life. And as you can see, I bolded this. He sums this up by saying that when we are at work in a certain way, an active state results.
Yeah.
So it's similar to sense of life, but it also is different because sense of life isn't active. It's a background and a byproduct. Whereas for Aristotle, it seems to be some weird mix of being like,
yeah,
a byproduct, but also not the thing that's not a byproduct.
Yeah, it seems like in between, something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, going by his way of understanding psychology and how people act.
Right.
Which is definitely different than what we're used to. And after 2,000 years, of course, it'll be different.
Yeah.
So it's interesting to see how he views it differently. But I think we could think of it as, say, think of any person in the news. I mean, I could think of, there's a certain way that they act and hold themselves. There's a certain active way of being. There's not just like a potential there, but there's a thing that they're doing, a way that they uniquely act as themselves that makes them particular and actively involved with the world around them.
Okay, let's see if we can deal with this one. This is the roof thing, which we can get rid of. This is a longer passage, but I'm basically on every single thing. I get stuck like this because it doesn't, I can't quite make sense of it in any way that feels actually real. Let's see. Okay, so firstly, happiness assailable from within makes us love change even when it is for the worst. What do you make of that?
And it is.
This guy must just be in a professor's room talking to professors all the time because you can't make sense of like half of what he says, or at least I can't.
To me, this is very specific. I don't think personally, I even think this part's that valuable.
Yeah, okay.
I mean, it's interesting, but like, I wouldn't focus on it much. Like, if I were reading this intro too, I'd read the paragraph and not really put too much emphasis on it because like, oh, I recognize it's not that essential for why I'm reading Aristotle. It's kind of like a discussion about a particular viewpoint on our active states, but wouldn't make it clear what it means by active states. It's more of a specific academic focus that I might look into if once I read further.
Okay.
Because I get the general idea that, oh, there's a human nature and there's virtues that we focus on, the person acting, things like that.
So I get that for Aristotle, virtue is he calls this second nature, which originally I interpreted as habit based on, which makes sense still, habit based on Mortimer Adler's introduction. Like you build certain parts of your personality by habituating them. But why does he call it the second nature primary? Like in what sense is it because he sees it as better, or
I don't understand the distinction yet either.
okay.
I almost feel like I disagree on Sachs here on that point, but I'm not quite sure yet.
Moral
the word
virtue does.
sign, I can comment on that.
Yeah, what's that?
It just means in the usual, like an indication of.
Oh, okay.
It's
Moral virtue does not constrain a human being, but completes us as a roof completes a house. There you go with he loves his house completion.
Well, Aristotle does too. He mentions houses a lot.
Okay. Well, by the way, so does Greg Salmieri. He gave a lecture on values, and he says it's like, philosophy is about being a good architect for a house and making things fit together. So
definitely Aristotle scholar would say that.
I mean,
like if anyone reads Aristotle a lot, you're just bound to start talking about houses in a philosophy lecture. Even I've done it, I think, because that's what you immediately start thinking of.
Right.
Because he uses house and construction a lot as an example of things.
And then things pleasant by nature have no opposite pain and no excess, because they set us free to act simply as to what we are.
These are the parts I understand better after reading all the organize. Like I'm used to exactly what Aristotle means by these things at the end here of this paragraph. Pleasant by nature. Reading the signs is just like the indicators of this.
Yep.
Whatever it is. Things pleasant by nature. What necessarily causes pleasure, not incidentally causing pleasure. It's not like you can go to the park and accidentally run into $1 million on the ground. I mean, that's not like that's not something that causing happiness by nature. Like something causing happiness by nature would be like, say, a
meal.
Like, yeah, sure, a meal. By nature, that would cause happiness or pleasure. Just by nature, what it does.
That could have an excess, because in this case, he's talking about stuff with no opposite pain and no excess.
True.
So I don't really.
Oh, that was maybe not the best.
No, I gave that example, but that's all I could think of. That's by nature.
Yeah. Well, things that just feel good, even just in, I guess, good music.
Okay. I see. All right. Okay. There are some things that have no, like you can't listen to good music so much that you feel pain listening to it or something like that.
You're right. There's no painful amount. The pain might be, say, no pain.
Right.
Yeah, there's no opposite of that, really.
This is the earlier part of that discussion, actually, of like, what the hell is talking about happiness assailable from within?
Yeah. Sometimes when I see weird phrases like that, like I usually put that in my mind as that's probably going to be put aside from what I understand more, because that seems like a very deep technical question that a scholar would want to know, or after you've done some good amount of experience.
Right. Do the investigations of these scholars yield practical fruits, or are they just like, are they really I come in with that assumption, and I probably go wrong, because to then ask lots of questions, like I could be asking questions about some nitpicking they're doing which is irrelevant to actual life. But
sometimes it helps to know about what the details. Part of the difficulty is knowing which details matter for me, because obviously I'm not going to want to know every academic question, but some of them matter a lot to me, like all the discussion I saw with Joe Sachs on entelechy and helped me immensely, but other things didn't do so much for me.
I see. Okay.